a date which will live in infamy. That's how the president described it the next morning, and that's how it lodged in the American memory. December the 7th, 1941, the day a sleeping giant was struck out of a clear blue sky. The story we all absorbed is a story of total shock. A peaceful Sunday morning, a nation caught completely off guard, a treacherous bolt from the blue that no one could have seen coming. Almost every piece of that picture is wrong. Start with a single fact that should stop the whole myth in its tracks. 10 days before the attack, the commanders in Hawaii received a message from Washington that opened with words no one could misread. This dispatch, it said, is to be considered a war warning. Not a caution, not a maybe. A war warning, the United States military telling its own Pacific forces in plain language that war with Japan was expected at any moment. America was not surprised that war was coming. The government knew. It had known for weeks. It was reading Japan's secret diplomatic messages almost as fast as Tokyo's own officials were. It watched the negotiations collapse, watched the deadlines pass, watched Japanese fleets put to sea. The question in Washington in early December 1941 was never whether Japan would attack. It was only where and when. So, in what sense was Pearl Harbor a surprise at all? That's the real story, and it's stranger and more unsettling than the myth. But before we go into it, one thing has to be said plainly, because a darker legend has grown up in the gap the truth leaves behind. There is a persistent claim that President Roosevelt knew the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming and deliberately let it happen to drag America into the war. That claim is false. It has been examined by historians for decades and found to be built on misread documents and wishful logic, and no serious scholarly research supports it. This is not the story of a president who knew. It's something harder to accept. It's the story of a nation that saw a war coming, that had cracked its enemies' codes, that received warning after warning, and still, through a chain of very human failures, got caught asleep. Not because one man betrayed it, because a whole system could not hear the alarm over the noise of its own information. To understand how that happened, you have to start with the astonishing thing American intelligence could do in 1941, and the one fatal thing it could not. By 1941, the United States possessed a secret weapon so valuable that only a handful of people in the entire government were allowed to know it existed. American cryptographers had broken Japan's most sensitive diplomatic cipher, a fiendishly complex machine code the Americans nicknamed Purple. The intelligence it produced was codenamed Magic, and it meant that when the government in Tokyo sent secret instructions to its ambassadors in Washington, American officials were often reading those instructions at the same time the Japanese ambassadors were. Think about what an advantage that is. The United States could listen in on the private thinking of the Japanese government. Through the autumn of 1941, Magic laid bare the collapse of diplomacy in real time. American leaders watched Tokyo set secret deadlines for negotiations. They read the growing urgency, the hardening tone, and at the final days, they intercepted an order from Tokyo to its embassies to destroy their code machines and burn their secret papers. An unmistakable sign, to anyone who read it, that war was days or hours away. It was partly that message that triggered the war warning sent to Hawaii. So America was not blind. It was, in a sense, reading its enemy's mail. But here is the fatal limit that the myth always forgets, and it is the single most important fact in this entire story. The code the Americans had broken was Japan's diplomatic code, the language of ambassadors and foreign ministers. It was not Japan's naval code. The Imperial Navy ran its own separate operational cipher, and in December 1941, the Americans could not read it. Not a single Japanese naval operational message from the previous 12 months had been decoded. The messages that carried the actual war plans, the orders to the fleet, the target, the date, the route, were written in a code the United States simply could not crack in time. That distinction is everything. America could hear Japan's diplomats arguing about peace. It could not hear Japan's admirals planning for war. And the attack force counted on exactly that. The fleet that steamed toward Hawaii, 6 carriers and their escorts, one of the most powerful naval strike forces ever assembled, sailed under total radio silence. It sent no messages for anyone to intercept. It crossed the empty northern Pacific in a deliberate blackout, precisely so that no codebreaker, however brilliant, would have anything to read. This is why the conspiracy theory falls apart on contact with the facts. The one channel that might have revealed the attack was the naval code no one could read, carrying orders to a fleet that was saying nothing at all. The picture of Roosevelt poring over decoded Japanese attack plans is pure fiction. Those plans were never in American hands. What America did have was something subtler and, in the end, more tragic. A scattering of clues, none of them a smoking gun, that pointed toward Pearl Harbor for anyone able to see the pattern. The trouble was that almost no one was looking in the right direction. Everyone expected Japan to attack. They just expected it to attack somewhere else. By late 1941, the logic in Washington seemed obvious. Japan was starved for oil and raw materials, and the resources it craved lay to the south in British Malaya, in the Dutch East Indies, in the Philippines. That's where the prize was, and that's where every eye was fixed. When American leaders imagined the coming war, they saw Japanese troops storming ashore in Southeast Asia, seizing the oil fields and the rubber. Hawaii barely entered the picture. Pearl Harbor, the reasoning went, was simply too far away and too well defended to be a serious target. It sat thousands of miles from Japan. Its harbor was shallow, and conventional wisdom held that the water was too shallow for aircraft-launched torpedoes. To work a comforting assumption, the Japanese quietly demolished by modifying their torpedoes to run in shallow water. The idea that Japan would send its carriers on an enormous, risky gamble across the empty North Pacific to strike the US fleet at anchor struck most American planners as far-fetched. And so the warning signs that pointed at Hawaii were consistently read as pointing elsewhere, or not read at all. There had been signs. As early as the autumn, American codebreakers had intercepted a message in which Tokyo instructed its consulate in Honolulu to divide Pearl Harbor into a grid and report precisely which warships were moored in which berths. In hindsight, it is a chilling document, a request for a targeting map. At the time, buried among a flood of Japanese espionage chatter from consulates all over the world, it did not set off the alarm it should have. It was one signal in an ocean of them. That war warning of November 27th captures the confusion perfectly. It told the Hawaii commanders that war was imminent and then pointed them the wrong way, suggesting Japanese moves against targets to the south. The commander of the Pacific Fleet and the Army general in charge of Hawaii's defense took the precautions that made sense against the threats they were told to expect. They guarded against sabotage, They worried about the Philippines. They did not brace for 6 carriers coming over the horizon at dawn. There was even a peculiar defensive decision that grew straight out of looking the wrong way. Fearing sabotage by local agents far more than an air raid, the Army in Hawaii had ordered its fighter planes parked wingtip to wingtip in the open, out in the middle of the airfields where they could be easily guarded, which turned them into a single, perfect target for the bombers when they came. The precaution against the imagined threat helped guarantee the destruction from the real one. Compounding all of it was arrogance. Too many American officials simply could not believe Japan capable of pulling off something so audacious and so complex. It was a nation they had underestimated for years, and that contempt curdled into a fatal blind spot. A daring carrier strike on Pearl Harbor wasn't seen as unlikely so much as unthinkable, and armies rarely prepare for the unthinkable. The pieces were on the table: the war warning, the burned codes, the grid of the harbor, the missing carriers no one could locate. Laid side by side today, they seemed to scream the answer. But they were never laid side by side. They were scattered across different agencies and different desks, each guarded by its own secrecy, and no one held them all at once. And then came the morning, when the last chances to sound the alarm arrived and slipped away one by one. The final hours before the attack read like a catalogue of missed chances, each one a moment when the alarm might have been raised, and each one lost. The first came before the sun was fully up. Outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, in the dark early hours, lookouts spotted the conning tower of a small submarine where no American sub should have been. The destroyer USS Ward moved in, opened fire at around 6:45, struck the little craft, and sank it with depth charges. This was a Japanese midget submarine, one of several trying to slip into the harbor ahead of the air attack. At 6:54 in the morning, more than an hour before the first bombs fell, the Ward radioed a plain language report to headquarters. It had attacked and sunk a submarine operating in the defensive sea area off Pearl Harbor. An American warship had just fired on and destroyed an enemy vessel at the harbor mouth. It was, by any measure, an act of war in progress. But the report climbed slowly up a sleepy Sunday chain of command, met with doubt and requests for confirmation, and no general alarm went out. The hour that warning bought was simply spent. Then came the second chance, and it was even more direct. At 7:02, at a radar station called Opana on the northern tip of Oahu, 2 soldiers watched their oscilloscope light up with the largest echo either of them had ever seen a huge formation of aircraft, more than 100 miles out and closing on the island. They phoned it into the information center. The officer taking the call knew that a flight of American B-17 bombers was due in from California that morning, and he assumed this must be them. "Don't worry about it," he told them. The blip on the screen was not the B-17S. It was the first wave of the Japanese attack, nearly 200 aircraft, and the men who had spotted it were waved off. And there was a third warning, racing in from Washington itself. That morning, American codebreakers had decoded the final part of a long Japanese message breaking off relations, along with an instruction to deliver it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington time, which was dawn in Hawaii. The Chief of the Army recognized the timing for the threat it was and ordered an alert sent to Hawaii at once. But the Army's radio link to Honolulu was down that morning, so the warning was handed to a commercial telegraph company. It traveled to Hawaii as an ordinary civilian cable, A messenger was still carrying it toward headquarters, by bicycle when the bombs began to fall. 3 warnings: a sunk submarine, a radar screen full of aircraft, a decoded message pointing at the exact hour, each one real, each one arriving in time to matter, and each one lost in the gap between knowing and acting. At around 7:45 in the morning, the first Japanese planes came down on the airfields and the battleships, and the argument about whether Pearl Harbor could be surprised was answered in fire. In less than 2 hours it was over. More than 2,400 Americans were dead, much of the Pacific battle fleet was wrecked or sinking, and the country that had read its enemy's mail and posted a war warning 10 days earlier lay in smoke. Not because the warnings never came, but because they were never gathered into a single hand in time to matter. So who got it wrong, and what did they get wrong? Start with the version that never dies, the claim that Roosevelt knew. It is worth confronting head-on because it is the most seductive answer and the most false. The theory says the president had advanced knowledge of the attack and held his forces back to let it happen, to force a reluctant America into the war. Decades of investigation have found nothing to support it. The evidence that would have revealed the attack, the naval operational orders, was in a code the United States could not yet read, carried by a fleet under total radio silence. When one writer tried to revive the conspiracy with claims of intercepted messages, historians took his book apart, showing documents misquoted and evidence twisted. And the Japanese officers and radio operators themselves have always insisted the strike force broke no silence for anyone to hear. The conspiracy is a ghost story. It survives because it offers something comforting: a villain, a plan, a reason. The truth offers none of those. But the popular memory gets it wrong from the other direction too. Pearl Harbor was not a bolt from a clear blue sky. It was not a nation blindsided by an enemy no one saw coming. Every senior figure in Washington knew war with Japan was days away. The surprise was never whether, it was where and how, and that surprise was manufactured not by Japanese magic, but by American failure. The best explanation came from a historian named Roberta Wohlstetter, who studied the disaster years afterward and gave us the idea that has defined it ever since: signals and noise. The warnings of Pearl Harbor were real, but they did not arrive as clear signals. They arrived buried in an overwhelming roar of noise. Thousands of intercepts, rumors, and alarms pouring in from a world at war, most of them pointing elsewhere, many of them contradictory. The handful of clues that pointed at Hawaii were nearly impossible to pick out at the time. They only look obvious now, arranged neatly in hindsight, stripped of the chaos that once surrounded them. And the noise was made worse by the way America handled its own secrets. The priceless magic intelligence was locked in a circle so tight that the commanders in Hawaii, the very men who needed it most, were never allowed to see it. Information sat in separate compartments, in separate agencies, and no one was charged with assembling all the pieces into a single picture. Add the deep underestimation of Japan, the Sunday morning complacency, the assumption that the blow would fall to the south, and you have the anatomy of a catastrophe that required no traitor at all. That is what the story gets wrong in both of its popular forms. It was not a total surprise, and it was not a conspiracy. It was the most human failure imaginable. A nation that had gathered nearly every piece of the truth and could not put them together in time. Pearl Harbor wasn't a surprise in the way we were taught. Everyone knew the war was coming. What no one managed to do until the planes were overhead was believe where it would land.